Trappers versus bankers. Setting the scene. Two foreign worlds apart or two parallel worlds housing the same underlying dynamics but comprised of different pawns and kings. The latter is how I describe the juxtaposition of Wall Street culture and that of inner London council estates, often adeptly referred to as the hood, especially among younger incumbents. Major players depicting Wall Street culture are usually investment bankers, which span from traders to capital market deal makers, also known as rainmakers. On the other hand, the major players embodying areas described as the hood are largely referred to as trappers, synonymous with the hustlers. The interesting thing is that unless you possess cross-sectional experiences of both worlds, it would be near on impossible to recognize any similarities, not least draw parallels between the two. These days, there are a notable amount of talented professionals who during their formative years garnered invaluable life experiences derived from growing up in unsheltered environments that expose them to things children should not experience. Life is not perfect, but these individuals have extracted the positives from seemingly dire negative situations and made remarkable transitions into worlds where, on paper, the odds of breaking through are extremely slim for them. Having been in these figurative transitional shoes by virtue of my upbringing, I find it remarkable how similar the world of investment banking is to my experience growing up on the North Peckham estate during the 1990s and Peckham more broadly in the 2000s. Yet despite this, individuals from each walk of life tend to view each other as complete foreigners, incapable at the very least of empathizing with one another's mindset, daily struggles, hopes and dreams. But when you strip back the titles, the shiny offices and dinners at the Ivy, you find that the traits displayed by trappers in the jungle, that is the hood, are particularly similar to high flyers in the investment banking industry, especially among the more junior counterparts. The traits alluded to are potently desirable and sought after by hiring managers in the banking segment, so it makes sense to cast a light on this, especially as many cite a talent drain at the mercy of other industries such as big tech. Living in a bubble. Junior bankers and financiers spend a lot of time in the office, or more recently at the helm of their homemade work-from-home setup. Nevertheless, most major investment banks with a London presence are based in Canary Wharf, where convenience is at the core so as to adequately service the huge concentration of time-poor deal-makers. From the minute you disembark public transport or whichever desired mode of movement, you don't actually have to leave the Wharf complex for any reason. It houses the eateries, the GPs, and very importantly, Goldsmiths Jewelers. Having both necessities and luxury immediately to hand is a blessing from one perspective because of its ultimate convenience. Completing a deal while making all of your appointments and getting the groceries done will never be an issue again. Simultaneously, this is also a curse because you tend to spend more hours within the same square mile and run the risk of disillusionment. Not everyone can operate in such a reality. I draw a close comparison to my experiences growing up on the North Peckham estate in South London during the 1990s. It was a far-reaching building complex of many council estates, interconnected by corridors which formed the vascular system of the community. The estate was so vast that as a 5-year-old running up and down the landing, I was clueless that there were much more of the world to see. 21 years later, and the memories are just as vivid. The estate housed parks, laundrettes, shops, and many other amenities which I did not interact with given my infancy. Perhaps most conveniently, the local primary school, Gloucester, was situated at the foot of the numerous exits that run alongside it, so we'd go weeks on end, never leaving the estate except perhaps for church on Sunday. So in both instances, the banker and the person from the hood, where the trappers reside, both know what it feels like to live in a bubble where needs are catered for but at the expense of a hyper-focus of a specific hustle. For the banker, that means getting the deal across the line or managing duration risk during the Fed meeting, while for the trapper, it means hustling for the next set of coins necessary to put food on the table. Nevertheless, common ground between the banker and the trapper is clear to see, and the philosophical thinker in me posits that a strong degree of commonality is supportive of a positive relationship between two human beings. Food for thought. Being street smart. In banking, prospective applicants are expected to demonstrate aptitude beyond traditional book smarts and instead apply their intelligence to commercial awareness and usefulness. Life isn't purely theoretical, and the reality is that perfection doesn't exist in practice. Employers like to see new joiners demonstrate up-to-date awareness of the sector, the overall macro environment, and how the bank's operations are impacted by external factors outside of its control. All factors from the client base to shareholders and everything in between have vast and important implications. Adding a layer to commercial awareness would be what the layman describes as street smart, as in a basis of common sense derived protocols that allows an individual to function effectively in scenarios beyond the expected theory. I'm pretty sure that senior traders will attest to the frustration experienced once or twice when a hot off the press first-class graduate struggles to adapt to an environment which requires you to put down the book of theory and think about the logical, simple decision so as to not overcomplicate things. At the core of being street smart is the learned know-how of interacting with people in opposition-structured scenarios. For instance, a banker needs to be street smart in managing expectations, intentions, and requirements of investors, company management, and regulators when structuring or advising on the deal. This requires negotiating across various institutions whose desired outcomes are not always aligned. Relationship management and savvy thinking are paramount for the success of these interactions. In the hood, trappers and the young onlookers are all too familiar with crisis management, not for the same business-orientated purposes, but in many cases as a means to survive. It may sound extreme that being street smart can sometimes be a matter of life or death, but for someone from that reality, it's unfortunately normalized. In such an environment like North Peckham Estate, young people were taught common sense protocols from a tender age that pertain to navigating and surviving dangerous situations that arise from living in a melting pot where the level of desperation is markedly acute. These broad protocols, coupled with lived experiences, helped me learn about human nature at a primitive level, such that the threshold to being shocked by a decisional outcome is lower than it perhaps might have been if I had grown up in an ecosystem against an entirely different backdrop. A poignant example of this is the protocol used to de-escalate a situation where one inadvertently finds themselves in the middle of a turf war, which is often the case. For instance, although I lived in Peckham, I had church services with my family in Wandsworth, which required us to travel through Brixton. People from these areas generally didn't mix for reasons that didn't make sense in the slightest. Nevertheless, I was always armed with a de-escalation protocol which were applicable for numerous life or death encounters. I knew I'd had to deploy said protocol if I crossed paths with anyone from the same bubble who recognized me as an outsider and launched the dreaded question of, "What area are you from, bruv?" Being street smart or equipped with the right set of protocols here was systemically important for survival, as the wrong chess move could easily end up in an unfortunate, unnecessary altercation. Understanding how I as an individual was interacting with external factors beyond my control is akin to understanding how a company interacts with the world that governs it, such that incremental change can be taken in the grasp and levers can be pulled to generate a desired outcome. As you probably guessed, the natural sense of naivety quickly diminishes and the common sense sixth sense becomes especially sharpened. Whereas in a banking setting, commercial awareness and being street smart is from the perspective of the institution. In a hood setting, it's from the perspective of individual survival. Back your boy. Loyalty is one of the most important traits when it comes to desirability in teammates and co-workers. After all, at least pre-COVID, bankers generally tended to spend more time with their co-workers than their spouses, and especially those on the more junior end of the scale. In any degree of close human interaction, you would find comfort in knowing that your counterpart is loyal to the bounds set within that relationship. This becomes especially important when the going gets tough or the stakes are high. I've seen many examples of high-performing teams deliver fantastic results and were largely supported by the loyal dynamics within the camp. After all, loyalty breeds dependability, which in turn builds trust and thereby supports development. When employees develop their career and feel happy, they tend to do better. And if that's the case, the team as a whole stands to benefit. Employees tend to find high attrition rates concerning, and I'm yet to find a management team who doesn't deploy measures to stem it. Circling back to the old North Peckham estate, loyalty is firmly placed on a pedestal as the core of an upstanding human being. The community culture fostered in an environment where people are banding together by being firmly placed against societal odds is generally remarkable despite the documented shortcomings. Trappers were born to be loyal. On the point of shortcomings associated with blind loyalty, even then, the fact that people who do not own their postcode display such depth of passion that if this was channeled in the right way, in line with something positive, it would have a fantastic impact. If you want loyal characters, extend your search to the hoods, and as the rapper Nines eloquently entitled his studio mixtape, these youngers remain loyal to the soil as long as there's a vision to buy into. Surviving volatility. In banking, specifically securities trading functions, managing volatility is a bedrock of the job description. Separating erratic human emotion from the process of handling billions of dollars of risk is not only important but in practice is a highly regulated activity, especially since the high-profile greed-fueled rogue trader incidents that once plagued the industry. Operating under pressure is the norm within the banking space more generally, as competition is fierce and client standards are super high. Some higher-end managers look at diverse backgrounds as a means to unearth gems whose background demonstrates such capability. For example, military experience and leadership roles often come to mind. I urge them not to overlook life experiences as one of these factors. For instance, some of these kids go to school every day faced with the pressure of mere survival and obtaining safety due to the environment around them. But yet, some stars keep shining and achieve fantastic grades regardless. Often, their potential is overlooked because they may not fall into certain selection criteria geared towards talent from other walks of life. Not everyone secures a place at a target university in order to tap into the privilege that comes with it. Believe me, I can attest to that. You can learn about volatility from textbooks or pressure from trading floors, but some are exposed to real-life pressures and instead the volatility of occurrences are not in terms of multiple standard deviation moves in a financial securities context, but instead in regards to safety-threatening situations. This forms the context which many of these people learn technical skills. They have different foundations but can push on to become great. The art of building lines. One of the standout skill sets necessary for a successful career in banking is relationship management and sales. If you don't have a strong client base or know how to service that client base to generate revenue for your company, then it could really be difficult to push on beyond the more junior rankings. The high-flying bankers who do this part of the job well possess seemingly natural attributes which allow them to walk into any room and immediately strike a rapport with a prospective client or colleague. In most cases, this generally leads to fruitful relationships for both parties down the line. Now, what do these hotshots have in common with the most standout salespeople associated with growing up in places like North Peckham Estate? Well, some of the most talented people I've ever observed from research have been those in the business of distributing illegal substances to clientele of much higher social status. Interestingly, these street salespeople display a knack for strong client discovery, engagement, and servicing, also known as building a line. Again, for a young person from the hood, the protocols from observing this reality can be enough to sow a seed of skills ready to be later developed. There are positives and all negatives. All these elements, if fine-tuned in the right way against a completely different backdrop, would be valuable to companies, particularly those with high pressure and expectation embedded in its very lifeblood. Bando diaries. Another stark comparison that comes to the fore is the banking MD versus the senior trapper. Juniors of both subsets are usually particularly keen and motivated when it comes to making a good impression and demonstrating capability. From the all-nighters in the office to being 24/7 on call, many see it as a rite of passage whether or not it's healthy or ethical. For the juniors within the grasp of trappers, peddling county lines is often depicted as the route for proving oneself, despite the glaring risk factors that stem from being underage in a foreign city and embroiled in illegal activity. Nevertheless, people relate to pain points, and in the context of hyper devotion to work or trapping in the bando, there are plenty. A clean slate. What I find interesting is that on balance, institutions are given chances to amend mishaps or make up for prior wrongdoing. They tend to be punished, sometimes with bankruptcy, but more often with fines and things of a similar magnitude. After a while, the consciousness forgives or forgets, often not distinguishing between the two. Institutions are comprised of people, so people shouldn't be prohibited the opportunity to turn new leaves, particularly when the stains on the tarnished side is derived from someone's external environment. After all, no one chose where to be born. Instead, the experiences people from uncomfortable backgrounds are exposed to should be viewed in a positive way. That is, to draw out the positive impact on one's character. The aim here is not to place trappers or hood-based experiences above any other, but merely to highlight its often overlooked validity. Within these lenses, bankers may surprisingly begin to see some of their own characters mirrored in the beings of trappers from completely different worlds. Crossover into the parallel world. The familiarity would probably surprise you. I dare you to try.